Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, I'd like to welcome participants and speakers to our panel event today. It's a special one. It's called Movements for Change, Pathways to Achieving Gender Equality. I'm Juliette Powell, and I want to remind you that today is a bilingual panel. Ça veut dire que si vous avez envie de poser des questions en français, faire des commentaires en français, vous êtes les bienvenus. We are so lucky to have our live interpreters who can do interpretation in both English and French so that everyone gets a chance, not just to listen in, but also to ask those questions. Don't hesitate to interact with us in English and in French. We're really looking forward to having a larger conversation. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a technologist. I've been called a thought leader, both jobs which are considered to be traditionally male. And of course, because we're talking about gender equality, we're going to be talking about the different ways that different groups have been able to get a little bit closer to gender equality and what we might be able to learn from each other. I'm really looking forward to co-creating the future with you. And of course, I'm not alone. Please note that once again, the webinar will be bilingual, but it is primarily in English. So for those of you who are Anglophone, don't worry, we have not forgotten you. There's a little interpretation icon that's going to allow you to select the language of your choice, and it's right at the bottom of your screen. Donc, au bas de votre écran, vous allez voir un petit icône d'interprétation qui va vous aider. Vous avez seulement à cliquer dessus et à choisir la langue qui vous sied le mieux. In addition, again, don't forget to use that Q&A box to ask those questions, make those comments as they pop up without interrupting anybody. I will try to highlight some of those thoughts. And of course, a very special and deep thank you to the United Nations for offering this forum and the platform that we're using today. We're adapting the 65th Commission on the Status of Women to a virtual environment. And of course, that has everything to do with COVID-19 and the pandemic. Of course, it's a welcome initiative, but next year we do look forward to getting a chance to convene in person. On va faire du face-à-face probablement l'année prochaine, mais on est très chanceux d'avoir une session virtuelle grâce aux Nations Unies aujourd'hui. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to focus today on, the idea of creating a feminist movement. There have been several waves and there might still be several to come, but our session will really convene those women leaders who are comfortable sharing their personal stories of resilience and advancing gender equality, ladies that are willing to talk about the hard work that it is and the important work and what it means to them and to their communities. And of course, as I mentioned, we'll be exploring ways that we might be able to learn from each other and co-create strategies and tactics to move forward together. There is no one size fits all when it comes to community building, especially when it comes to achieving gender equality. So once again, this session aims to bring together women that not only just walk the walk, they also talk the talk. And that isn't just our panelists. That is some of you that are sitting at home, that are sitting in your offices, that are here because you think that it's an important part of a larger movement. And again, we're not just asking panelists to participate. Each and every one of you is invited to share your story. So we're going to be sharing a variety of approaches through this particular session today so that we can better learn from each other. And beyond the personal stories, they're also going to go through step-by-step overviews of the ways that they achieved what they've been able to achieve. So do take notes. N'oubliez pas de vous avancer quelque chose pour prendre des notes aujourd'hui. J'ai l'impression qu'on va avoir énormément de choses à apprendre ensemble. Et donc, j'en profite pour présenter nos panélistes aujourd'hui. It's such a pleasure to be able to introduce our panelists today. And I would ask you, if not to applaud, but to share in the enthusiasm because they have some incredible work to share with us today. First off, we've got Sheila North. She is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Legacy Bows, and she's also the former Manitoba Keewatinowi Okimakanak GrandChief. Sheila's been recognized for her efforts in building bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities during her time in the media, and most recently at the Manitoba Keewatinowi Okimakanak prior to becoming the GrandChief. She also worked as a journalist for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation for 7 years. Sheila, over to you to share why you're so passionate about what you do.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Sheila North, and I'm very happy to be with all of you. An elder taught me that we have to start using our Indigenous languages more in public spaces to honor our sovereignty. So I do that when I can. And so I'm very honored to be here. And why I do this, I think it's because I think we don't have a choice. I think that our ancestors have given up so much and invested so much in all of our futures that we have to live up to their aspirations. And by us being successful and supporting each other as part of those aspirations. And I feel privileged to be in the space where I am and alongside with all of you incredible people everywhere. So I'm very happy to be part of the panel, like I say.
Well, Sheila, thank you so very much for being here. I know that you have been part of this larger movement for a very, very long time, and you're not alone. So I'm not sure whether you know Lauren or not, but let me have the pleasure of introducing her to you as well as to everyone who's participating with us today. Lauren Ravone is the Executive Director of Oxfam Canada. She's committed as a feminist, and she's also committed to social justice. She's been an advocate for 15 years of international development experience, including Oxfam Canada since 2011. Lauren has conducted extensive policy research. She's campaigned on issues of food justice, on women's economic equality, on sexual and reproductive health, and of course, the rights and the role of women's movements. Lauren, I get the feeling that you're incredibly passionate about what you do, but maybe you can share why.
Right. Well, thanks for the invitation. And it's really an honor to be with such a group of women. So thank you. I'm really glad to be here today. And I am, I guess the advantage of having CSWB virtually this year is that we can all be joining from different places. And so I'm joining from Montreal today, the traditional Mohawk territory and unceded land. And I'm very privileged to live in this beautiful space that the Mohawk Nation shares with us. So hello, everyone. As you said, I'm the Executive Director of Oxfam Canada, and Oxfam Canada focuses all of our work on feminist activism, on women's rights, on working both in gender and emergencies, so an emergency response, in long-term development work to support women's rights organizations and build up women's transformative leadership, but also in policy and advocacy and movement building here in Canada. And we're in a really privileged position as Oxfam, and I wanted to underline that today, is that we're a large organization in a large global Oxfam movement in over 90 countries. And so we're very cognizant of the privilege that we have of having a name that is recognized, of resources around the world. And we want to make sure that when we come into spaces working with women's rights organizations, that we're acknowledging women's movements where they are, and we're there to be supportive. So some of the experiences I'm hoping to speak about today are us playing a backseat role supporting the women's movement and really giving all the space that the women's movement is able to take, and providing resources where women's movements are sadly under-resourced. So very privileged to be part of the conversation on women's rights, and Oxfam Canada is really honored to be part of this movement.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And of course, you're sitting in my hometown of Montreal, where some of the strongest women I know were born, including my mom and my grandmom. I'd like to introduce now our next speaker. It is Anjum Sultana. Anjum is the Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communication for the YWCA. She's an award-winning public affairs strategist. She's a media commentator, a public speaker, a researcher, and she has expertise in gender equality, public health, and in civic engagement. In 2020, Anjum was named a Global Woman of Distinction by the NGO Committee on the United Nations Commission of the Status of Women. It is such a pleasure to have you, Anjum. I give you the mic.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. And I'm glad that while we are staying safe from COVID, through this platform, we can connect across time zones, across countries. So it's an honor to be here. I'm currently calling in from Toronto, also known as Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 and is the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And I come to this work at YWCA Canada as an immigrant, as a settler, as a racialized woman, as a Muslim woman. These are the different aspects of my identity that I try to bring to the work of gender equality and gender equity. So about YWCA Canada, we are in 9 provinces and 2 territories, and we offer on the ground many essential services such as housing and homelessness services, childcare, supporting around employment and training services, and supporting survivors of gender-based violence. And in this pandemic, we've actually seen the need for our services increase because we've seen gender inequities that were rampant before the crisis have been deepened, along with inequities around racial, class, and many forms of inequity. And I think for us, we've been thinking a lot about how can we leverage this moment where there's this increased public consciousness of inequities and use it as a window for systemic change. So not just providing solutions and resources in the here and now, but thinking about how do we work towards something that can be long lasting for generations to come. And so I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of the work that we've been doing on a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada and the work we've been doing with our YWCAs across the country and speaking to that pan-Canadian perspective around gender equity.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you. And of course, we're going to hear from our next speaker. Her name is Nikki Fraser. Some of you might already know her. She's an Indigenous advocate from Kamloops, BC. She started Uniting Our Voices, which is a platform working for and towards inclusion and equality by creating a space for more Indigenous voices to be heard, to build connections, and inspire more change makers through stories and engagements. Nikki's a part of the United Nations Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations Youth Envoy. Hi, Nikki.
Good morning. Ywca, Nikki Fraser and Squest to Kamloops, Stechlin. Good morning, everybody. I'm from BC, so it's 10:15 a.m. over here. Like Sheila, I'm so happy to be able to sit on the panel with you finally. I introduced myself in my traditional language. My name is Nikki Fraser. I'm from the Secwepemc Nation, which is located in the interior of BC. So I'm very happy to acknowledge that I am coming to you, speaking to you on my ancestral homelands. And I'm just grateful to be here today to be able to participate in conversations like this, to share the importance of having diverse Indigenous voices at tables. Far too often, I've sat at many tables, many panels, and many discussions being the only Indigenous woman there and feeling tokenized for that role. And I started shifting my work to being, we need more spaces. And I wanted to cultivate more spaces. And I felt like during my advocacy work, a lot of people would say, oh, you're the voice. And that never felt right for me. I never wanted to take anybody's voice away. And so I said, I'm gonna start advocating for more spaces. Why just one individual? Why not 5? Why not a whole group? And so that's what brings me here today. And I'm excited to share my personal lived experience with you guys and to learn from everybody else. So Kukstachum, that means thank you in my language.
Oh, I love it. All right. And our final speaker today is someone else that you might know. It's our CEO, Juliette Anderson. Now, she's got over 15 years of senior and executive level experience in international development, non-for-profit, civil society, human rights, and gender equality, you guessed it. She works closely with multiple stakeholders on international development policy-related issues, from Canadian and global decision makers to young leaders, as you can see. In 2019, Julia spearheaded the shaping of a renewed collective vision by Canada's global health sector, and that resulted in a $14 billion 10-year investment by the Canadian government, which isn't easy to do. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Juliette. I just have to say, you have made bios interesting, and that is a very hard thing to do. So you've already leveled up this conversation just by the way that you've introduced us, and I'm grateful for that. Hi, everyone. I'm joining you from Peterborough, Ontario, the traditional lands of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe people. I've been very grateful. I've worked and studied in Peterborough for some time, and had the opportunity to engage with many of the elders in the community. And I really hope that my words today, as well as my work on an ongoing basis, does honor to those teachings and what I've learned to date. And I'm really excited in continuing to learn and to learn from this panel and the participants here today. So you were asking everyone, Juliette, for why, and I think the interventions from each of these speakers have articulated my why. There's a diversity of perspectives on this panel. There are some voices, but as Nikki rightfully pointed out, there are many more voices that are not here. And that's my why, to create a platform, to create an organization that works in coalition and tries to create sort of big tent approaches to the work that needs to be done, because it's an all hands on deck moment. We're in a crisis moment in the women's movement, in the She Session and all these things. And that's what gets me up every day, to think about how can we create the most equitable and largest tent to bring the most number of people and diverse perspectives together to really affect and impact change. So excited to be here, and back over to you, Juliette.
Well, thanks so much. And I think that you really, hit the nail on the head with that. And more importantly, also to build on that, to act on that. So getting together is great, but actually being able to work together, to collaborate together, to build on each other's ideas and practices, that to me would be an outcome that I'm hoping that we can get to today. So let's jump to it. We've already met our panelists, and I would like to ask each one of you to kind of talk about the organization that you've already mentioned that you're affiliated with. But again, give us a high-level description this time of the strategy that you used. How did you measure that success? What are the metrics of success for your initiatives? And what are the key milestones that others might be able to import and kind of include into their own models? Let's start with you, Julia.
Excellent. So there's various facets of the work that the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health undertakes, but I want to just zone in on one project that we've recently launched, which is the Equal Futures Network. And I encourage everyone to sign up and join. It's free. It's a platform. It's that big tent that we're trying to bring as many from this important movement underneath as possible. And I think when we started to conceptualize this movement, this moment to engage, was really before this huge conference that took place in Canada called Women Deliver. It's a global conference. It showed up in Canada a couple of years ago. And we were trying to think about ways in which to bring the critical domestic, local community movement and bind it and tie it up together with the global community grassroots movement. So everywhere you go, there's kind of these different levels of the women's movement or the movement for gender equality. You've got very local, you've got kind of domestic or international, you've got community-based, and all these different pieces. And we were trying to look for a way to sort of braid or tie it together, weave it together, so that people could learn from one another, movement builders could engage and learn from one another, so that folks' stories could be amplified because others were hearing about it. And I mean, often it's pressing share in this day and age, but it's also talking about it, integrating new ways of knowing, new ways of story into the work that they're doing based on what they've heard from others have been successful. So we were trying to create a platform that connected what was happening in Canada with what was happening globally, without a overly kind of transactional objective. So we didn't set out and say we are going to move the needle on A, B, and C like we do in some of our programs. We didn't set out to say we are going to reduce or work on SDG 3 and sort of this and this and this. We set out to say, if we brought this movement together, how would they direct us? What would they say that's different than when they weren't brought together? So the Equal Futures Network is really the same thing. It's trying to build on that work, bring together the domestic stories, which are many, with the international stories, which are many, and see what we can co-create together. We're going to put together a steering committee. We're just sort of we're bringing this back because we did have, I think, a very strong steering committee leading towards Women Deliver, but they had an endpoint. So we're sort of bringing it back into fruition to see where what we can do when we're all working together, and how we can, will we end up choosing a couple issues such as violence against women or a couple of these issues? Perhaps the movement might ask us to do that. Or will we actually just continue to be this communication platform, this bedrock for storytelling and for amplifying voices that otherwise don't have space or don't get amplified in the same ways? So we're thinking through all those things, and we welcome all the panelists, but also the participants to co-create alongside us in that project. And you can find all the information. We'll share it after this event at the equalfutures.ca.
Thank you, Julia. How about you, Nikki?
Great. So my journey really began at a grassroots level, what Julie mentioned before, and it all started. I didn't set out to be an advocate. I never knew that this is where what I wanted to do, and where I literally now my heart lies on ensuring that there's equality and respect for all Indigenous people and their voices. And it started out when I was 25, and two elders actually seen something in me that I didn't see in myself yet, and they planted a seed in me that literally blossomed into me being able to speak at the UN. I've spoken at CSW before at the UN, and I never thought I would have been able to occupy spaces like that. And so eventually my role, again, like amplifying voices and sitting in many spaces and many tables, and recognizing the fact that there's so many other voices, so many of my peers that are strong advocates themselves. And so why I started uniting our voices was because of that reason. Was I didn't want to always be the only one. I wanted to be able to share my platform, to share those opportunities, so that my peers can also occupy spaces like that too, and share their gifts, because I believe that we all have gifts to contribute, and we're all leaders in our own ways. And so, you know, some people may be gifted at speaking publicly. Some people may be gifted in art and showing their leadership through forms of art. And so I wanted to be able to highlight those different kind of leaderships, to break down those working in silos. Being a young leader for the Sustainable Development Goals has really taught me that you can't really achieve one goal without working on another goal. And so I felt like there was a lot of working in silos, and, you know, different sectors working alone on one separate issue and focusing on one separate issue, but you can't really achieve anything when you're just silo working by yourself as a group. And so when I was a young leader for the Sustainable Development Goals, they asked me, what goal do you represent? And I remember sitting there, I'm like, am I supposed to represent only one goal? And I'm like, oh, all of them are so important to me. I want all of them to be achieved by 2030. And you can't really do that without working together. And so that's why I'm here. I want to be able to work alongside, work with, and work for the Indigenous community. Thank you.
Oh, that is so beautiful. I love the way that you put that. And there's something to be said about cross-disciplinary teams and diverse teams. What happens is you get a lot more creativity. It generally takes a little bit longer to make a decision because you have so many more voices, but the outcomes are generally much better for all. And I applaud you for that initiative. That is a beautiful thing. Thank you for sharing that with us today. And of course, we've got Sheila. Hi.
Hi. Hi, Juliette and Nikki. That what you just described and summarized what Nikki just said is exactly what female leadership looks like. You take everyone with you along the way. You don't go from A to B, you go from A to Z and then move everyone. That's why things take so long sometimes. So I'm very happy to be able to recognize that now. And I learned that from someone who actually studied the difference between male and female leadership. And so I'm really proud of us for that reason. There's a couple of things that I'm doing at the moment. One is always working on MMIW. I don't feel like that issue is ever away from me. In fact, I feel like I wear it like a coat with me everywhere. And I'm very happy and proud to do that. But at the same time, it is grueling and taxing on ourselves and our bodies, I think, sometimes. And some days more than some. Yesterday was a little hard, maddening, seeing what happened and hearing what happened to Debbie Baptiste after her son Colton Bushy was killed, and then hearing what the RCMP did and how they treated her. You know, I believed her from the beginning, and now I'm glad that many more people are hearing what actually happened. So, you know, it's not always easy, but it's very gratifying to work on that. And one of the other big projects I work on constantly is raising awareness. And one of the things I did while I was a GrandChief was create a documentary, and it's called 1200 Plus. And it's a 90-minute full-length film that my partner Leonard and I, my film partner Leonard and I worked on. And we've shown it in different versions, like 90 minutes to 30 minutes to 10 3-minute versions to different outlets. Like big corporations want to see it now. Superintendents groups want to see it. A lot of universities in the States want to see it. So we're creating a website and a curriculum at the moment to raise more awareness about what the issue is. Not so much as a blaming exercise, but as an awareness exercise, because I think the more people are aware of the issues, they'll start turning around to help. And I see that. We know that commissions and inquiries have helped with that. At least some people say that the reports and findings go up on a shelf and never brought down again. But at the very least, the TRC, for example, the MMIW inquiry report, they spur conversation. They spur people to find out what's going on, and you know, some of the calls to action are directly towards media and broadcasting. And so I plan on using the film to be a tool in schools of all ages, university to lower grades, to help women and girls, but also the rest of society to understand what the issue is and how they could help and protect our women and girls, and you know, be a help instead of a hindrance in their process to become who they want to be, right? And so I don't want to sound like I self-prescribe or anything like that for women, because it's their choice on what they want to do. But I want them to have options and have success as they go. And that's part of the work that I do also at Legacy Bows, where I work right now. I feel like I'm helping with capacity building and capacity enhancement, more importantly, because a lot of places and people already have capacity. They just need enhancement. And so we do a lot of training on leadership and on basic, you know, skills of communication, for example. And so we offer these to First Nations, to all First Nations, but also non-Indigenous corporations. We do organizational reviews. One of the calls to action in TRC is 92, telling businesses to shape up, basically saying, check your policies. Are they racist? Check your hiring practices. Are they racist or not? Are there barriers in it? And Canada can look at that too, when they say that you have to have both French and English to be a governor general or anything like that, right? Official. And that's causing a barrier for a lot of First Nations to become in these positions. And so is that racist or not? And that's a good way to look at it. But yeah, so I'm doing these things in order to help, especially Indigenous people, because that's where my focus is at the moment. I feel like I have to help our community while I become an ally to other communities. And one of the saddest things I see with Indigenous women, especially when they've become victims of violence and become a statistic, is that they've become vulnerable. They've had to rely on other people for sustenance and support. And I want to encourage women to become empowered and powerful and beautiful matriarchs that they're meant to be, like Nikki and all of you. Like that, your display of strength is more important and more needed now than when we saw the inquiry, when we saw our women crying all the time, and that's sad and hard to see, and reinforcing the negative stereotypes about us. But that's not who we are. That's part of who we are, but that's not who we are. We're strong, resilient women, and so that's what my work, I feel like, supports and entails, like I say.
Sheila, you're not the only one who thinks that. I think many people that are listening today would absolutely agree with you. Anjum, I heard you, I didn't hear you, but I could see you nodding to the point where I felt like inside you were saying, yes, yes, I give you the floor.
Thank you. And it's been great so far to hear of what drives the folks on this panel and the work that needs to continue to happen. And I think this pandemic has really demonstrated what we all need to really recommit ourselves to. And so part of what I wanted to share is the work that YWCA Canada has been part of around a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada, making the economy work for everyone. And it started about a year ago. A year ago was when many countries around the world, many of you perhaps were also facing the impacts of this pandemic. And for many of our YWCAs across the country, that was the same consideration. And on March 11, when the World Health Organization called COVID a global pandemic, our YWCA started to work in overdrive to ensure that they were able to step up for their communities by providing essential services, supporting community members who may have lost their jobs, who may have lost their housing, who are experiencing some of the things that we've seen during this pandemic, like the rise in gender-based violence. And so from coast to coast to coast, our YWCAs were doing that essential work, but also with the view that this was not going to be enough. We actually need to be investing in the things that truly matter. And I'll say for the YWCA, last year we celebrated our 150th year anniversary as an organization, as a federation. And as we start to look through the archival records, we were seeing that, this was not the first pandemic we had experienced. We were there during the 1917 flu. And when we think about what was important then, it seems like many of those things may be important now, which is investments in care and community. And so that was one of the big realizations for us that, what has been saving us in this crisis? It's been things like healthcare. It's been things like mutual aid networks. It's been things like grassroots communities coming together. It's been nonprofits and charities stepping up for their communities. And so in many ways, what has been saving us during this crisis should also be our roadmap for the future for post-pandemic recovery. And so for us, in this land, but also across the world, we've seen dramatic and severe gendered impacts for COVID-19. And so because of who has been impacted economically, socially, and health-wise, I will say women have been on the front lines of this crisis. Globally, they make up 70% of the global health workforce. But what's interesting is they only make up 25% of the leadership roles. So again, we're seeing that disconnect. Who is on the front lines and who gets to call the shots? So that's something we need to absolutely disrupt. Going to Juliette's point around leadership as well, and the work that her organization and Oxfam does as well. And so because of who has been impacted is somewhat dramatic and distinct, they need to be at the center of the decision-making table. And for us, we also see Canada can play a leading role around what we've been calling for, which is an intersectional feminist recovery. So in July of last year, our YWCAs across the country came up with this plan. And a couple months later, we saw positive adoption of the plan. I think what it really spoke to is the power of advocacy. We really need to be pushing our politicians and holding them accountable. We need to be coupling data with stories. We need to be ensuring that we take action wherever it's needed, changing the public discourse, talking to our elected officials, organizing locally at the provincial and municipal level as well. And so I'm happy to say some of our recommendations have started to be taken up. One in particular is the Task Force for Women in the Economy. So I'm going to stop here. Maybe we'll go into that a bit more, but that is one action that we had called for that we're happy to see, along with many other feminist groups. But we cannot let that be enough. We need to ensure that that actually translates into changing the situation on the ground in communities across the country. So I'll stop here, but really want to say the importance of networks and coalition building, but also everyone has an ability to create change or influence change. It's kind of figuring out what are you good at as an organization, as a person, and lending your gifts in that way. So I'll stop here for now.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. That's definitely a teaser also for what you're going to be able to share with us in a few minutes. One thing that I definitely want to clarify, though, for our international guests, who hopefully soon will become active participants and not just guests, I just wanted to explain a couple of the acronyms that were used in the roundtable so far, because even I had to look them up, to tell you the truth. I wasn't familiar with them. So the MMIW report that was mentioned earlier, right? So this is a very important report. It's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report, the MMIW. Okay, and the other report, the other acronym that was mentioned is the TRC. So for those of you who are Canadian, it's quite possible that you haven't heard of this, but it's definitely something that all of us in the world should take note of. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. So there you go. Hopefully you've got equivalents in your neck of the woods, wherever you may be. And I really liked your point, Arjun, at the end, where you were also inviting individuals to participate, because it's sure, we've got governments, we've got organizations, and we've got leadership, but we also have to, especially now in the time of pandemic, each one of us act as our own leaders, because sometimes we get tired and we need like other leaders around us that to help keep that momentum going together. So it's a collaborative effort at every level, the macro, the micro, and everything in between. Julia, I wanted to make sure that we got back to you, because we've been kind of going on a number of different tangents here. Was there something else that you wanted to add?
Did I miss Lauren? No.
No, we can go to Lauren as well. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything else.
No, that is, I am good. I'm just soaking it all in and have now a ton of notes to try to jump off of, but I want to hear what Lauren.
Well, thank you. It was Julia, by the way, that sent me the note on the acronyms, because I was just, what are we talking about here? Thank you very much. All right, Lauren, would you like to tell us about your organization?
Great, thanks. And I just want to build on what Nikki was saying on how all of the Sustainable Development Goals, or all the pieces of social justice, are connected, and also on Anjum's point on the power of advocacy, and kind of reflecting on the role that an organization like Oxfam can have in terms of supporting movement building and advocacy. And I thought I would give you one example that might sound a bit different from what the rest of what we've heard, but we've been trying to see as an organization where we can best support the women's movement and provide value, knowing that there's such strong women leaders within Canada that are doing important advocacy work. And one area that we work on internationally a lot is on the issue of tax justice. And you know, when a lot of times when people hear about tax, you kind of roll your eyes or think, oh, I don't want to talk about taxation. But actually, taxes are what make it possible to invest in public services. And a lot of the things that Anjum was mentioning in terms of building back our economy, building back our society, ensuring that women are able to make it out of this she-cession that we've seen caused by the pandemic, investing in things like childcare, in anti-violence work, in truth and reconciliation. And so as part of our work as an organization has been trying to put the issue of tax justice within the feminist discourse. So make sure that we understand that fiscal justice is a feminist issue. And unfortunately, historically, conversations around federal budgeting or fiscal policy have been really the remit of men. So male economists, male policymakers, and there's been very little space for women's rights organizations, feminist activists, social justice activists to be engaging in those discussions. And so at Oxfam, over the past couple of years, we've really been focused on how can we get women's voices and women's leadership in the spaces where these big decisions are made about how we spend kind of the money that we raise collectively, how we raise it and spend it in terms of federal budgeting. And so it's been interesting because we want to ensure that women's voices are there, but at the same time, we know that traditionally the women's movement in Canada has been so under-resourced. There's so few resources that very few women's rights organizations actually have in-house capacity to be doing policy analysis, to be doing advocacy work. They're so focused on immediate service delivery because they just haven't been given the kind of sustainable long-term core funding to be able to engage in advocacy. And so what I can speak about more today is this work that we're doing to bring women's organizations, give them the capacity to build up their policy analysis, to share their perspectives, but also access spaces that have been traditionally very closed. So for example, a couple of years ago, we started counting the number of times the word women was used in parliamentary hearings around the budget. And sometimes it was less than half a dozen times that the word women was actually mentioned in hours and hours and hours of public testimony on how the government should be making its federal budget. So things like that. Also looking at who is actually being invited to testify before the government to decide how money is raised and spent. Hardly any women, hardly any women's rights organizations. So we took it from there to start facilitating spaces where the government could actually be hearing from women's rights activists. And so it's been kind of a coalition work in terms of getting women's rights activists to the table, but also making the government aware of these incredible women leaders who have a lot to say and recommendations to share, but the government didn't even have them on their radar to be inviting to the table. And so I think we're going to be talking more about approaches to partnerships, but one of our approaches at Oxfam has to be to make sure that since we have access to decision makers, we're able to make it into spaces, ensuring that others have that access too. So for example, anytime we have access to a parliamentary hearing or to a meeting with a minister or a member of parliament, ensuring that we can invite women's rights organizations into those spaces because they need to be talking directly to these decision makers. So it's been really a work of supporting women's rights allies and activists to engage in what has been an uncomfortable male-dominated space around fiscal policy, then making the government aware of those women so that they're able to build on their good ideas. And it's also being able to put forward tangible feminist policy proposals because we can only assume the government is going to act if it's pushed and if it's given good advice. And so the women's movement has lots of good advice to give. What we need to make sure is that that good advice and those good ideas get into the ears of the people who are making decisions at the federal level. So wanted to share some of those experiences and happy to talk more about the partnerships involved and how we navigate as an ally to the women's movement.
Thank you. I'd also like to underscore some of the women leaders that are in government. There aren't that many, but there are a few, and I'd love to see more. So beyond just advocating to the powers that be, let us become the powers that be. I'm a big proponent on that. We are going to be talking now about those feminist movements and the campaigns to achieve gender equality. There are different ones happening at different times. Some are working in tangent with one another. But most importantly, I'd love to hear about the ones that each one of you is working on. And I know that you all have a width and breadth of experience to share with us. So let me just set it up a bit with a question and kind of go from one to the other to respond to, and you can also respond to each other as you feel comfortable doing. So in each one of your organizations or your personal cheminement, what role have partnerships and collaborations played in the feminist movements that you've seen and in achieving gender equality? And when you have gone at it alone, and when have you needed to reach out to connect? Like, what are the distinctions between those two modes of being, or are they happening concurrently? I'd love for any one of you to begin with this conversation because this is not rehearsed for those of you who are watching us. And I want you to really speak from your own experience and from your heart about those partnerships and the roles that they've played, as well as when you've decided to go alone as opposed to, in a group.
I can jump in if you want on that one. I think kind of coming from a policy and an advocacy background, it's so important to recognize that yes, we can make wins by going at it along, but those wins are not sustainable over the long term. And also the government only will bring about change and progressive policies if they feel like there's a movement behind it, if Canadians are asking for it, if there's public pressure. And the best way to ensure that changes that we achieve are long lasting is to make sure that that momentum keeps up in society. And so, you know, when I was mentioning this work on fiscal justice and tax policy, it's to say, yes, we could probably get a few women economists into the room with the Minister of Finance, who is now a woman, which is pretty cool, and, you know, make some concrete proposals for how we could reform our tax system, stop tax evasion that's robbing us of the resources we need to invest in social services and all the rest. We could do that. But ultimately, if this is a closed door conversation amongst a few academics, a few experts, it's not going to be transformational. And so in terms of movement building, what we need to be doing is organizations that have more resources are larger. I think of organizations like Oxfam, like the YWCA, making sure that we're supporting women from more marginalized community, racialized women to be in those spaces and sharing their own perspectives and their own recommendations. Because not only will ultimately the policy recommendations put forward be more robust, be more adequate and representative of their realities, but it also creates this constituency that then the government needs to be responding to, feels that pressure that, you know, when they're going into an election, when they're going into decision-making moment, they're speaking directly to these constituencies. And so, yes, while it can be expedient to have the couple of policy wonks and academics and feminist researchers and feminist economists in the room, that is not how we build long-term change. And so I think that can be in part the frustration, is that if you want to do things well and collectively and support movement building, you need to recognize that it's a longer-term process. It's not only about quick wins. And I think in the example I was giving you about kind of work on fiscal justice, it's also recognizing that we need to be building for long-term change. So for example, you could have a quick win on the government announcing an investment in XY women's issue, or you can be saying, let's make sure that gender budgeting is the norm so that every time the government is proposing new initiatives, is spending money, it's thinking about how it's affecting women, men, gender diverse people in different ways, and how are we actually spending our public fund to be advancing gender equality. And so if you look at gender budgeting, that's a long-term change. That's not kind of a day to the next, and it's a harder sell as well, because obviously all government want quick wins that they can be showing. And so it's kind of being courageous enough to be investing in the long run and not only looking for the quick wins, and finding allies within government. And as you said, Juliette, there are some strong women leaders now in government, and we need to build alliances with them. And I think, you know, the women's movement has been thrilled to be able to work with the first women Minister of Finance in talks around feminist economic recovery. So we need to use these opportunities. And it's not only about alliance building in the women's movement kind of to lobby the government, it's finding where there's allies wherever they are to advance a collective goal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I would suggest doing all of those things simultaneously, because if we really are talking about building the long term, it's not going to be one or two initiatives. It's going to be all of the initiatives and the various impact that they have. Anjum, would you like to comment on the idea of partnerships as opposed to going at it alone?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. For sustainable, more effective, more long-lasting change, partnerships are essential. And I want to speak to two partnerships. So one, for the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, we partnered with the Institute for Gender and the Economy. And that was a really great opportunity because as a civil society organization, we were seeing challenges on the ground. And we were also using that data, that information to help drive our public policy. But we also recognized there is an important role for academia to play in this conversation. And I don't think we see enough of those partnerships across different pillars of society: academia, civil society, labor, private sector, you know, voluntary groups, so many different parts of society. I think this pandemic has shown us no one has all of the answers. So if we really want to create and actually come through this crisis, we need everyone at the table, everyone's ideas, figure out what works, what doesn't. And I think that was an important partnership that we developed in the midst of a pandemic. And that has, I think, really opened up some interesting doors. One of the interesting things that we've seen is actually chambers of commerce that historically, in our perspective, we haven't really seen engaged in the childcare conversation, for example, actually starting to talk about it. Now, of course, there may be different approaches to childcare and different policy mechanisms, but the fact that we've actually seen chambers of commerce, CEOs of banks, credit unions, so many different types of institutions actually speaking about its importance, I'm actually seeing something that we haven't seen in this country in 50 years, which is the real potential for nationwide early learning and childcare system. So not a patchwork, but a system. And we'll see if this comes to fruition in the upcoming budget. But I think there has been never this broad consensus in society. And I think about the power of partnerships in enabling that. Another example of partnerships and collaborations is really thinking about our country. Our country is diverse. Many different communities make up this country. And I think, unfortunately, we don't often hear from every single part of our society across this land. And so one of the things we've been trying to really push is at YWCA is really starting to look at things through a pan-Canadian approach, thinking about the impacts in rural and remote communities, thinking about what's happening on the East Coast, what's happening on the West Coast, what's happening in the prairies and everywhere in between, in the northern communities as well. And so in our YWCA movement, we are a federation. Our federation is similar to the Federation of Canada. And we've been really thinking about, what's an issue that has been stuck in jurisdictional quagmire for quite some time. One of them is childcare. The federal government says it's not my responsibility. The provinces and territories say it's not their responsibility. Municipalities say it's the same. But what we've been doing is we've been actually going province by province, talking about why we need to invest in childcare. So we've been doing this work at the federal government, but we've been starting to work in doing briefings for the public service in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Nova Scotia, talking to our colleagues in the Northwest Territories. So we're really trying to make it clear that at every single part of society, we need a feminist recovery. So our feminist recovery plan, it was primarily focused on the federal government, but we've been really hard to see all of these different levels of government actually talking about a feminist recovery as well. So I think if we want things like childcare, if we want things like a national action plan to end gender-based violence, if we really want to see a national housing strategy that reaches every single community in Canada, we need to start to bring different parts, different levels of government together. And I think civil society can play an important role with that. I think the last thing I would be remiss if I did not mention is the dramatic impact on young people, young women during this crisis. So Gen Z women, they make up 2.5% of Canada's workforce, but they represented 17% of the job losses. And so one of the things that keeps me up at night is, we've been hearing a lot, women's labor market participation has dropped to levels we haven't seen since the 1980s. My fear is that in 30 years, we may be seeing the same thing. Right? When you lose a job at any point in your life, it's hard. The earlier on in your career, it can be devastating for, the next 10 years. So that's one thing I'm hoping to see the task force really grapple with around the intergenerational impacts of this crisis. So with that, I'll close, but yeah, really looking forward to kind of building on in the Q&A.
Excellent. Sheila, I know that you've been watching attentively. What do you have to share with us about partnerships? Or the idea of going at it alone?
Yeah, everything that has been discussed so far is very similar to the plight of Indigenous people in general, both men and women. And I think what people need to remember as well is that within Indigenous communities, we're set even further back as Indigenous women in a lot of ways because of who we are as Indigenous women. And I think it's just starting to come out more and more about the awareness of that and how that's happened. And I can trace it back to the early days of settlers when they first started coming. And you look at the treaty process, you look at the treaty documents, it's all men signing it. The only mention of a woman is Queen herself and how she represented the crown. And the treaties were made with the crown, and they referred to her as Her Majesty, of course. And then you don't see women being referred to in any of the treaty documents. And so we know that our nations have matriarchal, you know, naturally matriarchal led communities. And that means women were the delegators. They were the ones that designed where, you know, communities could be and how they should function. And so women leaders were very, very important for our communities, and they still are, even though we don't have official roles all the time. Our nations would be much poorer and in even worse, dire situations if we didn't have our natural women leaders there in the community supporting. But how much stronger will they be when they get to the point where they are, you know, more in charge and taking their place in the hierarchy, right? And I'm always cognizant of the fact that, of course, our men are important as well. I have a son and I have a baby, a new grandson, and I'm a cookum now, and I would never want anything less than the best for our men too. But our women need to be brought back to where they need to be. And where I saw the strength, for an example, huge example, is when I started reporting in 2005. That's when I started really being aware of the issue around MMIW. And it was at that time I realized I was a survivor of the issue, looking at my experience and how my transition happened from my reserve to the city here in Winnipeg, and how difficult it was, and how many times, at least 3, maybe 4 times solidly, that I could have been a statistic if things didn't turn out right for me. But instead, here I am as a survivor. And so when I learned I was a survivor in 2005, I was starting my career as a journalist at CBC. And it was from that time until 2015, I noticed our women getting stronger and stronger, louder in voice. And I think social media helped with it as well, because they started holding rallies on the streets. Sometimes it was 3,000, sometimes it was 3, sometimes it was -50, and it was +30 other times. And a lot of the people that were on the streets were the ones with baby strollers, moms and females, and some men here and there, but mostly females, going on the street saying enough is enough. We need to end the epidemic of MMIW. And it was also during that time that my claim to fame, I actually created the hashtag MMIW while I was a communications person. And now I see it everywhere. It's being used everywhere. And you know, it's high time, but it's the women who pushed the issue and who inspired all of us to become advocates of the issue, because they were relentless. Can't say that that's when the movement happened. It's been building up for generations. Women have been speaking out, our women leaders have been speaking out, saying we have to have a place. And so now it became, but the voices of the women became so powerful, it became a national election issue in 2015. All of the parties had to account on whether they were or not they would support an inquiry. And of course the Liberals did, and they made good on that promise. And it reached, the information and the awareness reached all the way to the United Nations, which I was a part of 2 times as well before this one, in New York. And some of the conversations I had with women from India and Africa and all over the States was the fact that our women and our advocates made this a national election issue in 2015. So they were asking us, how did you do it? What happened? Like, give us, you know, the goods. What did you do? And so we're able to share with them that it was just relentless, strong, powerful women and girls that didn't give up. And so I saw that, and as a witness, as a reporter, but also as a survivor and a family member. And individually, I will say that we still have a long way to go. I ran for the AFN in 2018, just a few years ago. And I have to say it's hard, grueling work to be among the men. The worst part of it was just at the heat of the moment when the elections were happening and people were voting. Some of the men were talking right into my ear and telling me to concede, get out of the way, concede, get out of the way. And so they saw me as a threat, and they saw women as a threat to their power and to their autonomy, that they had to come up to my ear and say that. And so that's still a reality. So we have a long way to go yet.
I am so saddened to hear that. I am sitting in New York City as I participate in this event today, and I am disheartened, but at the same time buoyed by all of the stories, all of the collective stories together, because I think that we've heard more good than bad, at least today. And I want to stay anchored in the good stuff. I think as women, many of us have undergone horrific abuses of all kinds at the hands of power, and that it's only as a collective that we can help overcome it. I'm a big believer in that because I am one of those survivors as well in my own way. And, you know, some of us are comfortable in sharing our individual stories, and others are more comfortable in supporting other groups that are standing up for women. And no matter where you sit in that spectrum, you're in a good place, you're in a solid place, and you are not alone. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sheila. I also wanted to bring up some of the amazing comments that we've gotten in the chat so far. Just a big shout out to Erin Gilchrist, who has sent a message to all the panelists and the attendees. She's thanking everyone for the insightful contributions, and she wanted to follow up on a theme that was brought up by Nikki and Lauren regarding the interconnected nature of social justice issues and the SDGs. They wanted to know what are the biggest barriers that you've come up against in advocating for solutions that really take this interconnectedness to heart. And particularly, she wanted to know about the policy level, but as well as in other areas. Ladies, I leave it to you. Nikki and Lauren, you can either give us a brief response or you can write it up in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
I'll give a brief response. Actually, thank you for that comment and that question and engaging in the conversation. I think that's so important and why we're all here today. And I want to acknowledge what Sheila has brought up when it comes from an Indigenous perspective lens. I think it's so important. Even though it is disheartening, we need to see those stories, acknowledge those stories, and witness their truth telling. So thank you, Sheila, for sharing that. And actually, I just published my first research paper as an Indigenous researcher on that exact question on interconnectedness. And it's so, it was just published this past few months ago. And in this paper, I did the interconnectedness of common themes that I heard throughout my advocacy work at an international level. And it first started off at a very local level, provincial and domestic level, where I constantly heard the abbreviation TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I heard the MMIWG calls to action and calls to justice. And then when I made it to an international level, I heard the term UNDRIP, and I heard the term, and that term stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the first time I heard that term, I immediately went back to my hotel room, Googled it, and started reading it. And it was adopted at the UN in 2007. And it was passed, and 4 countries didn't sign on to it in the beginning, and Canada was one of those countries. And so eventually our government did sign on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And here in BC, our government, provincial government, has made it legislation. And so now they're working it into our policies and stuff, which is great. That's growth, that's progress. And once I became a young leader for the SDGs and looking at the goals and the 169 targets underneath those 17 goals, I sat back and I'm like, I've heard this before. I've seen this before. I need, like, it's somewhere I've seen it before in my past. And then I started recognizing the interconnectedness between instruments, international instruments and local instruments, like the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. We're connected to UNDRIP, which is an international document. And then I recognized the connection between UNDRIP and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think one of the best partnerships is using those tools and mechanisms that are already there that have a framework, and individual actors and private sectors can use those documents because they were designed by Indigenous people with help from Indigenous people as a framework, not as the whole story, but include more Indigenous voices. But why reinvent the wheel when we already invested so much? And I know the truth of the reality is that these reports are done and they're put on the shelf, which is sad. But I think as individuals, it's our responsibility to make sure they don't collect dust. Yes, there's some very important work, there's some very important voices that were shared in the TRCs and stories that were told. And in the inquiry report, there was lots of truth telling, and we have to acknowledge those. And the government of Canada has also signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals and has committed to those, and they're all interconnected. And so that's where I again talk about breaking down the silos and working together. And I think one of the, as an individual level, one of the best partnerships I have ever had is other women, especially other Indigenous women. Far too often, there's a lot of lateral violence in all communities, in all nations. But I feel like my best partnerships were other women who lifted me up and me lifting up other women. And I feel like when one of us make it, we all kind of make it because we're all supporting each other and lifting each other up. And so I think, yeah, I hope I answered her question. Thank you.
No problem. Lauren, did you want to jump in as well?
Sure. Thanks for that, Nikki. Every time I hear you speak, it's really so inspiring. So thanks. I was just thinking of two barriers that I think we've all faced in terms of connecting the dots. One is that issues that we advocate for are often portrayed by politicians or by the media as women's issues and not issues of concern for all of society. And so segmented, and, you know, childcare being perceived as a women's issue rather than as a barrier to economic justice, labor force participation, you know, safe spaces for children and all the rest. And the list goes on. So kind of channeling off women's issues to the side and not making those the center of our national conversation, of election debates, of all the rest. And, you know, it takes the strong voices of activists like the activists that brought forward the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women to the fore to make those issues national electoral debates. That's the kind of work we need to get it into the center stage and not siloed off as a women's issue. So I think that's one barrier we face. The other barrier is really systemic, is that the women's organizations are underfunded, and the funding that women's organizations get are so project specific. So women's organizations are funded to work on a small initiative, on a topic, on a theme, rather than given the core support to engage in reflections and activism on social justice across the board. And we know that, you know, in the pandemic, women's organizations that might have been working on one issue rolled up their sleeves and worked on homelessness, worked on violence against women, worked on issues of job insecurity, so many issues, because that happens always. And, you know, at Oxfam, our experience working in emergency response and in humanitarian relief is that when there's a humanitarian emergency in a community, women's organizations are never perceived as humanitarian actors, and yet they're usually the first to respond, to be getting aid to their communities, to be responding to local needs, and yet they're not perceived as that because they're perceived as kind of working on one topic. Whereas no women's rights organization in the world, I think, thinks in terms of siloed themes. We all recognize how interconnected social, economic, political struggles are, and so we need the funding streams to follow that reality, and, you know, core support to allow women's movement to be nimble and reactive to opportunities, but also threats that we're facing collectively, to connect those dots. So I think both in terms of how our struggles are perceived and how they're funded is a huge barrier to connecting the dots that I think we all kind of intrinsically understand, but aren't able to connect just because of so many challenges that we face to support this work.
Such a great point. Does anybody else want to jump in? Erin, thank you so much for your question. That was really thought-provoking for all of us. I also want to bring in the voice of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Faranaz, who had a question for all the panelists. And Faranaz wants to know if all of you have committed to being part of a global local movement of some kind that embraces diverse voices and perspectives. Now, I could jump in and say, of course I know the answer, but I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, I can jump in on that first. I mean, the two kind of networks that that we're really pursuing are the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health broadly, which is organizations that are interested and committed to global women and children's health issues, and then the Equal Futures Network that I discussed. And I would say, you know, if those two membership bases are not diverse and are not inclusive, then they will have failed fundamentally. So we really are committed to creating space for diverse voices. And I think also building up the required muscle, the required tools, the required skills in order to enable diversity to really be meaningful and impactful. So moving beyond, Nikki spoke earlier about, you know, often coming to these spaces as the only Indigenous woman, and sort of she used the word token. And I think that's a really profound point that many of us have experienced in different ways, whether as the only woman, as the only young woman, as the only woman of color, is that there's lots of times in which we're invited into spaces to represent and to be something. And I think one commitment that we have at CanWaCH, and that certainly I personally have, is to move beyond that kind of representativeness and move into a place where people can meaningfully engage in partnership, be in dialogue. And in order to do that, we as a secretariat, we as a membership, require a fundamentally different set of skills than if we weren't trying to do that. And Sheila referred at the beginning to female leadership and some of the differences in female leadership compared to male leadership. And that really got me thinking. I mean, at CanWaCH, partnership is both one of our goals and one of our principles. And when I think about what's required to do partnership well, it's really being able to engage in difficult and uncomfortable conversations, being able to help people stay in their own lanes. Like, I mean, Lauren spoke about tax work, Anjum spoke about childcare. We all have these different areas where we need to specialize and be kind of pounding the pavement to get to a resolution on specific and distinct issues, while at the same time holding space for those who are working on distinctive and separate issues that also need to be propelled forward. So in order to do partnership well, and in order to engage in partnership well, I think we need to actually see partnership as a skill, collaboration as a skill, and we need to build our own capacities in that way. We need to reward it in terms of our employees and our staff. We need to lift it up and teach those skills within the workplace, and promote those skills when we see them, and elevate people who really are good at doing this work. And I think just coming from as the leader of an organization, that's been a real mindset shift for me, to see partnership not as like and collaboration not as like a side of the desk thing, or diversity, diverse voices, creating space, not as another thing we do, but as like a fundamental core that needs to be developed and we need to get really good at. And I think we've certainly met lots of challenges in that way, and we've you know got some learnings along the way, and we're not there yet. We're not as good as we need to be at this, but we're committed to every day improving and to thinking about it really in a meaningful way. I'll leave it there.
That's a great response, Julia. And actually, you just reminded me of something. So one of the commonalities as an outsider, so I do not run an NGO. I'm you know, an individual who is a technologist, and I happen to be a data scientist. And so I'm putting my data scientist hat on for just a moment here. It seems to me that all of the initiatives that we've talked about require information, they require data, and they require talking about the removal of siloing, the ability for that data to pass from one person to another, from one group to another, and to build on these data sets. And so let me just throw out there that one of the ways of partnering, beyond having the same goals and the same missions and the same funding, which is not necessary to collaboration necessarily, but being able to share the same data, to build on the same knowledge base and tacit knowledge, I think is incredibly important to any kind of meaningful long-term partnership. Because if you're not basing yourself in data, the people in power are in a much better position to be able to knock you down, no matter which organization you're coming from. And so that is my 2 cents on that particular note. I wanted to jump back into another comment by Erica, and then we're going to come back to our panelists to have you talk more about not just the challenges, but if there was one thing that you feel that all of us should keep in mind as we participate in this journey together of co-creation, but also individually, what would that thing be? I'm kind of planting the seed there so that all of our panelists can think about it while I just do a very quick side jump to Erica. And Erica, you have some really wonderful comments about each one of the panelists. Very thoughtful, thank you very much. But you wanted to pick up on Anjum's discussion around the power of partnerships. And so she's talking about like-minded organizations and how it's important to move the dial. And she was mentioning about Anjum's key example showcasing the value of engaging with groups that don't often appear within our buckets of work, which is really what prompted me to make the comment earlier about data science. But the question for all the panelists is, how can we continue to go about engaging the unusual suspects to move the dial? And again, who are these unusual suspects? I would guess depends on who you are.
Maybe I can share something that's during the crisis has increased, which is the presence of online hate. And for us, online hate is violence. So misogyny online, sexism online, racism online, xenophobia. And we're actually seeing that this hate, because we're spending more time online, it's something that impacts our lives even more. Online is our place of work, our place of socialization, education, etc. And we're actually seeing when online hate increases, that has the potential to translate into in-person violence. And we've seen many examples in Canada. We've seen many examples quite recently in Georgia and the US as well around anti-Asian hate. So for us, we've been also thinking about how do we target or how do we work with or push social media companies to take action. And one of the things that we're working on is this initiative called Block Hate, which is to center the experiences of survivors of online hate in these conversations. But also within Canada, online hate, the terminology that's used, perhaps is different and is experienced differently than the people who are perhaps coding the algorithms to take down hate, right? And so how do we actually take that information that communities are experiencing, work with social media companies who may not be fully representative of Canada's diversity, and start to figure out how do we work together to curb online hate. So that's something we've been trying. It's hard because, you know, it's a different kind of way of looking at the world sometimes, you know, different cultures of work. But that's one of the ways we've been trying to figure out, you know, the social media platforms are where this hate is being spread, but we in civil society know how that hate looks like, how that feels like. So how can we work together to address it? So that's one example.
That is a very, very powerful example, because you've got the efficiency mentality of a corporation that's really sole existence is to make money, right? That's all their mission is to make money. And then you've got the social justice mentality where the goal is to improve things for the majority of people and not just some of the people. And so how do you marry these two mindsets to get a company to move forward? I really look forward to hearing how you progress, or if I can help in any way. That sounds like a really, really meaningful move, not just for women, but for all people, I think, and especially those of us who don't have a voice. I hope that everybody here today has felt that they've had a voice. And if anybody has something to say and I haven't come to you, please just let me know. Send me a text message, raise your hand, whatever it is. Make sure that I see you. This is your job. My job is to keep an eye on you and make sure that I don't forget anybody, but it's also your job to kind of wave the hand and make sure that we get to you. As I said before, oh, we got 6 new messages because of that. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to say a big thank you to Claire for sending a message. Also, we've got, oh my goodness, Claire, you were very, very, very prolific. I don't know that I'm going to be able to get to all of the comments here because I do want to make sure that we also get to that final piece. The piece that I challenged you with, ladies, just a few minutes ago, where I said, if you only had one thing, right? One message, one challenge, one learning to share with this group today, what would it be? Hopefully something that we can build on, but whatever it is, I know that it's going to be from the heart. And whomever wants to begin, the microphone is yours.
I'll start because it'll be harder to do after I do this. I would say find a way, if you haven't done so already, to become an ally. I think allies make such a huge difference in our world. And it was without allies that without them, we wouldn't see changes. And I think Lauren talked about it earlier, and I've heard it many times. You know, governments and politicians actually have a harder time making huge policy changes without the support and backing of a greater group of people. So that's why it's important to become an ally when we see movements on the streets and people asking for supports. And I know that we all get inundated with calls for support on social media, come to this event, support this event. But I would encourage you to go to as many as you can, because when time comes, people will come and help you as well when you put out a call to say we need bodies and people to come and support the work that we're doing. And I've witnessed and noticed that over the last few years of how strong allies can be and should be. And wherever we have the opportunity, let's do it.
I like that. Nikki, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, of course. I definitely echo the allyship. That's something I got asked a lot during my advocacy work, and continue to get asked is how though? How? And it's like whatever you can contribute. And one of the best ways is to learn, is to educate yourself and to be aware, and to not let that knowledge stop at you, but to also pass that along. If I had, what was the question again? One wish or one commitment?
One thing that you would like to share, whether it's wisdom, a learning, maybe a challenge that taught you something difficult, but something that you can share with us that we can really take home and perhaps build upon.
I think that would be intergenerational dialogue. Intergenerational dialogue. That means when I first became a young leader for the Sustainable Development Goals, the Youth Envoy Office at the time, he said, you're never too old, you're never too overeducated to learn from a young person. And so to have those intergenerational collaborations to learn and to be a part of, the research paper that I published to the journal is called Knowledge Makers. And we're guided by knowledge keepers. So we have elders guiding us with our research papers as Indigenous researchers, as they are knowledge makers, and helping us become, they're knowledge keepers and helping us become knowledge makers. And so that collaboration is so important, and that relationship is really important. And far too often, I feel like young people's voices are, again, tokenized and not validated, are respected, are included in the conversation a lot of the time. And the SDGs, one of their missions is it to be youth-led. And I think that's so beautiful, because at the end of the day, young people inherit the outcomes, whether they're good or bad. And so if I to leave anything today, we would want to be a part of a legacy that is, making it better for the next generation of women, young women, next generation of Indigenous people. And that's ultimately what I want to do, is to be able to pave a path and open doors and leave those doors open and ensure that more young Indigenous people can go through. And that's the whole reason why I started in the beginning, was because, I do have 2 young, beautiful Indigenous children at home. And what drove me was that at the time, I had a daughter, and in 2013, 14, if she was to go missing, her life would have not been as valuable as other little girls, her peers that were non-Indigenous. And so that's what led me to my advocacy work. I said, I cannot live in a world where my daughter's life is not valued in this country. And so thank goodness for other, you know, the women behind me, the women that had led the way, our ancestors, to advocate for not only me, but for my daughter. So definitely believe in that intergenerational dialogue to learn from each other and the allyship. And thank you. I learned so much from you ladies today. So I'm looking forward to supporting your guys' work as well too. Kukshacham.
Oh, Nikki, that was incredibly thought-provoking. Thank you. And it actually reminded me, in technology, we've got something called geeks and geezers. So the old folks and the young folks that are really good at technology get together, and the ones with experience, the geezers, boy, do they have a lot to learn, and vice versa with the geeks who might be very proficient at technology and social media, but don't really have a framework with which to work on actually getting a mission through. And so those two groups together, along with the varieties in between, make a far more powerful team. So thank you for reminding us of that, Nikki. Really appreciate it. We've also got perhaps some words of wisdom from, let's see, Lauren, would you be up for it?
Sure. I'm just thinking of something that I experienced this weekend that I wanted to share. On Sunday, I brought my two little kids to a rally and to denounce anti-Asian racism. And what was incredible about this rally is that I was organized by the Progressive Chinese Community of Quebec and Stella, which is the Sex Workers Association of Montreal. And these types of alliances are incredibly powerful. It's bringing groups together that might not traditionally have collaborated, have seen themselves as having a shared mission, recognizing that there's moments for these alliances to be making connections between different forms of discrimination and hatred that we need to be calling out. And just the strength of that alliance in that moment, it was kind of mind-blowing to see how different communities all of a sudden were talking to each other, recognizing that their struggles are intertwined, and then having allies outside of the sex worker community, outside of the Asian community at the rally as well, showing solidarity. And I think, if I can look to the future, one thing that gives me hope is those sort of movements where you have allies from different walks of life who might not, agree on every issue, who might not always be in sync, but can find opportunities to build solidarity. And I think that, decision makers hear us more loudly when we come together and bridge those divides, and recognizing that sexist violence, that racist violence, that we can only tackle them if we tackle them together. And so a lot of the mobilization in the wake of the killings in the United States and the calling out of anti-Asian violence has given us an opportunity to really make intersectional feminism real, in the sense that recognizing that the violence against sex workers, the violence around marginalized communities, it's all intertwined. So that gives me hope for new ways of organizing that we can all be supporting.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that it's all connected, but it's also a reminder that we are all connected if we choose to see those connections and act on them. Thank you so much, Lauren. Anjum, would you like to share something, a word of wisdom before we leave?
Yeah, so I have a call to action. Everyone who's been part of this session today throughout UNCSW, you have been talking and hearing and listening about many different issues. And I'm sure there's one that you're very passionate about. I want you to take a step further and actually write about it. Think about that issue and write an op-ed, because right now in Canada, and I would say globally as well, there's actually not enough gender diversity in media commentary. I'm just going to put a resource in the chat. It's called Informed Opinions. It's basically an organization that's trying to advance gender equity in media commentary. And when you start to look at it through an intersectional perspective as well, gender, race, age, sexual orientation, there is a gap between the population and whose voices get publicized in media commentary. So I know all of you listening are very passionate about the issues that you care about. Write about it, because that's how we ensure we are vigilant on the progress we have seen, and to also stop potential drawbacks or rollbacks of our human rights or gender equity and racial justice. So that's my call to action. There's a resource in the link. Please do check it out. And I hope I see lots of op-eds, and feel free to tag me, feel free to share, because then we can amplify each other's voices even after this conference here today.
Oh, that is such a great idea. And those of you who have not taken note of the link, please do take a look. There are also some great connections so that you can speak to our presenters today, their LinkedIn profiles. You can go and connect and continue the conversation, which is all so incredibly important. I can't believe this time is already over. Thank you, thank you, thank you, not just to our panelists. I know that each one of our panelists understands how much you contribute, not just to the conversation, but to the actual movement every single day. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. Sheila, Lauren, Anjum, Nikki, and Julia, thank you for joining us and for offering all of your insights, as well as some of the things that maybe you didn't realize that you were going to say, but ended up coming out and really kind of getting us because you were saying it from the heart. Sometimes we can prepare remarks for these things, but it's the stuff from the heart that really gets through. And I think I've seen some of that from each one of you today. Thank you so much for that. As for me, well, I'm honored to be able to participate. It's interesting to be a Canadian living in New York, and I have been in the United States for the past year waiting for the border to reopen so that I don't have to wait 14 days of quarantine to be able to see my family on both sides of the border. I look forward to coming home, but in the meantime, I can genuinely say that today I felt at home with each and every one of you, because it's all about working and collaborating together. We've had several of our panelists who have given us not only fantastic ideas, strategies, tactics, but also how to avoid some of the pitfalls. And so I truly encourage everyone who's participating today to take into account everything that's been said and see how you can help move the dial forward. And for those of you who are saying, oh, I'll never write that op-ed, why don't you challenge yourself? You just never know how much you can contribute, especially when you give yourself the voice. Don't just wait for people to give you the voice. You take that voice and you say what you need to say from the heart. So I want to remind everyone also, for those of you who kind of joined us in the middle of the session, or who missed a comment or a link, all of this has been recorded, and that means that you can also see that recording outside of real time. And all you have to do is go to the CanWaCH website in the coming week, and or you can subscribe to the newsletter at canwach.ca, and you can get the information there. For those of you who want to know more about the amazing work of our speakers, do follow them on Twitter, on LinkedIn. If you get the opportunity, go meet them in person when it's safe or when you feel safe. One way or the other, please do stay connected, keep in touch, and thank you, everyone. My name is Juliette Powell, and I hope to see you again for another amazing conversation. Thank you.